to different countries around the world where we wanted to project the information that we had, which was the truth. And sometimes we would tell things about the United States that weren't particularly complimentary, but we wanted the people to know. We would tell the truth, whatever it was. And that way they became to depend on the United States. And incidentally, it was interesting, I ran across something that a man asked a government official in Africa, could I start a newspaper in your country? You know that a lot of the African states were run by dictators, as was the case in South America as well. And so he said, could I start a newspaper in your country? And he said, sure. He says, could I start a radio station in your country? He said, oh no. So, well, why is that? But, well, we start a newspaper, we don't have very many people can read, and so that won't make much difference. If we start a radio station, there'll be a lot of people who will listen to that. And how would we know what you're going to say with them? And by the way, that brings something up. You know, it's interesting how coincidences can occur. This past summer, my wife and I were at Yellowstone National Park. How many of you have been to Yellowstone? Well, it is the most remote area. Yellowstone Lake is the most remote area in the lower 48 states outside of Alaska. In a cabin at Yellowstone National Park, Yellowstone Lake, where we had no communication at all. There was not even a telephone line to the registration desk, which was, I don't know, a mile away. No radio, no television, no telephone, no cell service, nothing. Well, when we got up the morning after we got in late at night, and the next morning I wanted to know some news. I just, I want to know what's going on in the world. And I have this little portable radio that I carry with me wherever I travel, and I first tuned across the FM band. I could not get a single FM station. None. And so I turned to the AM band, and I tuned across the AM band. I got one station. Now, the sun was up, see, so I couldn't get skywave. But I got one station on the whole AM dial, and it happened to be in Pocatello, Idaho. I don't know, 125 miles away, something like that. And that one station that I could get on that one radio happened to be carrying our network. The same network we carry on WFLQ, Q100. And so Charlie Derrick was on there doing his morning program, and I said, Catherine, guess what? We're listening to our own network, way out here in the middle of nowhere. And lo and behold, he takes a call. You know, Charlie Derrick takes callers in the morning. And Joe Randolph calls in, and he puts him on air. My employee from French Lick. And here we are listening to French Lick, Indiana, on this network, on the only station that we could get, way out there in the middle of Yellowstone. If you'd be interested in seeing something about those curtain arrays, this dipole like this. This is a series of dipoles that are in parallel to increase the gain to 20 dB. Get 20 dB out of actually 8 different dipole sets. But they use more than one wire on each dipole, on each quarter wave, in order to increase the bandwidth, because they operate, of course, through a series of frequencies like we do in the ham radio band. And then they put all these things in parallel, and it comes down to a 300 ohm input to the transmitter. And those lines, those transmission lines, have got switches on them, so they can switch any transmitter to any antenna. And it was interesting looking through the reflector screens, because these transmission lines to the transmitter went through the reflector screen, quarter wave behind the dipoles, and they had insulators to keep the RF from arcing onto the reflector screen. And it was really interesting to see how they did that mechanically, how they assembled these antennas. but 20 dB gain is a lot of gain to get off of a series of dipoles with a reflector screen. So anyway, I thought you'd be interested in that. They had look at this, had 18 dB gain off of a rhombic, and there were a bunch of these aimed in different parts of the world. A lot of the paths went over the North Pole. But so this was a 500 ohm input, but some of those antennas were just amazingly long. And to see that antenna farm back in those days was just amazing, absolutely amazing. It's all gone now, but it was fascinating to have had an opportunity to see that. The National Association of Broadcasters Small Market Radio Committee. There were about a dozen of us from around the United States who met periodically in Washington at the NAB to discuss small market matters. Well, one day when we were meeting there in Washington, I got a call asking me if I would go over to the Voice of America. Now this was in 1990. It was not long after the Berlin Wall had come down, and there were now, instead of the former Soviet Union operating all of the broadcast facilities, now you had private entrepreneurs who were coming to the fore wanting to put their own radio stations on the air. And because by 1990 FM was so dominant, you had many of the former Soviet Union countries and the Iron Curtain countries that were now starting FM broadcast stations just like we have here in the United States, commercial FM broadcast stations. Because I hadn't been on the air all that long, that 7 years at that point, and we were a small market, they asked if I'd come over so they could interview me and talk about how to start a small market FM broadcast station. So that was kind of interesting, and I wound up on the air on V.O.A. on a very station that I visited